Hello everyone, and welcome to the new year. Today we're starting off with one of my favorite German guests, the journalist and publicist, Patrik Baab, who recently launched his own YouTube channel. Dear Patrik, welcome back.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you agreed to do this, and that in the second part of this interview, we'll be able to talk about your own channel and your motivations. But we have to start with another topic that concerns both of us a lot: the EU sanctions against EU citizens and Schengen citizens, including Swiss citizens. Among those affected are, for example, Jacques Baud and Nathalie Yamb, but also a German citizen, Hüseyin Dogru, who lives in Germany and has now been affected by these sanctions for over half a year, actually for a year. As a journalist who also lives in Germany, what goes through your mind when you think about that?
Hier wird ein
A foreign policy instrument of repression is being used here to destroy democracy and to suppress all opinions that deviate from the government's line. This shows that anti-democrats and warmongers are in power in Berlin and Brussels. Because this is, of course, a weapon of economic and political warfare, the imposition of sanctions. It makes me feel like I'm in exile in my own country. This government we have here in Berlin shows thoroughly anti-democratic tendencies, and I'm preparing myself for house searches, for my phone to be tapped, for my computer to be hacked. I expect my bank account to be closed, and that accounts and property will be confiscated. I'm discussing this with my lawyers and taking precautions, and I can only advise every citizen of the Federal Republic of Germany to do the same.
Raten, dies auch zu tun. Denn es geht nicht Nathalie Yamb.
Because this is not about Nathalie Yamb, and it is not about Jacques Baud. It is about the citizens. It is about intimidation. It is about enforcing obedience through the creation of fear. And this is a classic anti-democratic instrument of rule. Incidentally, the use of such instruments and the criminal prosecution of political opponents are classic signs of a dictatorship, and that means we are no longer living in a democracy in Europe. We have entered the phase of predatory capitalism, which seizes control of other countries, as we are currently seeing in Venezuela, in complete violation of international law. International law no longer matters at all, and the citizens themselves are being kept on a tighter leash for intensified exploitation.
Das ist der eigentliche Punkt. Und was die europäischen Eliten betrifft.
That's the real point. And as for the European elites, they have lost the war in Ukraine. They have failed to keep their own capitalist system, the profit rate in Europe's nations, high, to stop the decline of profits, by trying to pull Ukraine into their economic cycle. They have failed because of Russia. You see, they have lost the war, and now the citizens are to be exploited even more. Chancellor Merz openly announced this in his New Year's address, and that means if I increase the rate of exploitation in the workplace and in the economy, then I must at the same time tighten control over the citizens.
I haven't read or listened to his New Year's address. Can you tell me what you're referring to in it?
He said outright that the welfare state is no longer financially sustainable, that we have to work more, and that we must prepare for cutbacks. At the same time, a country like Ukraine, with which we are not even in a military alliance, since Ukraine in fact and in law is not a member of NATO, continues to receive funding and essentially only still exists because it is supported by the West, especially by Europe. And that will have significant consequences for Ukraine. In the spring of 2022, during the peace negotiations in Istanbul, Ukraine faced the question of either agreeing to a very favorable peace that would have ensured the country's integrity and survival, or continuing the war. With financial means, Ukraine was forced, Boris Johnson was the messenger, to continue the war on April 9, 2022. For a long time afterward, Ukraine faced the question of whether to accept a bad peace or risk losing even larger territories in eastern Ukraine. So the choice was between territorial loss or division. Today we are in a completely new situation. For Ukraine, the alternative is between the division of the country or the complete loss of its own statehood. That is the problem. The West has cynically led the people of Ukraine to ruin.
Die Menschen in der Ukraine ins Verderben geführt hat.
Solche Aussagen sind jetzt in der
And statements like that are now, in the EU, I don't want to say punishable, because that wouldn't be accurate, since that's something we still need to address. You said that the criminal prosecution of dissenters is a sign of dictatorships. The sanctions currently being imposed on dissenters are part of foreign policy, not part of the criminal code. They're not even criminal prosecutions. So it's still not a crime to say what you're saying, but it is sanctioned. It's sanctionable. And sanctions essentially mean the destruction of the existence of the sanctioned individuals. How are we, who all have to live under this sword of Damocles, supposed to deal with that?
Unter diesem Damoklesschwert jetzt leben müssen. Wie sollen wir damit umgehen?
Wir können nur unsere Heimatländer verlassen.
We can only leave our home countries because the population has fallen into a certain lethargy and does not resist. The numbing of the population and its preoccupation with distractions, that too is a strategy of domination. Our reflections and arguments, all of which are rational and should be discussed reasonably, no longer have any effect because resentment has pushed reason aside in large parts of the population. It is part of NATO's cognitive warfare, not to change the content of thinking, but to alter the form of thinking, the way of thinking, or to shut down thinking altogether.
Oder das Denken komplett abzuschalten. Und das macht man dadurch, dass man die Menschen in einen permanenten...
And that's done by keeping people in a constant state of fear and agitation. The range goes from promoting fear of war to spreading Russophobia. As NATO Secretary General Rutte said, we must prepare for experiences like those our grandparents had in the First and Second World Wars. It's enough, for example, when here in Berlin the police don't intervene at all, while mostly drunk migrant youths take over and dominate public spaces on New Year's Eve, terrorizing the local population with Polish firecrackers they throw into subway tunnels.
Mit Polenböllern, die sie in U-Bahn-Schächte werfen, terrorisieren. Und die Polizei steht grinsend daneben.
And the police stand there grinning. That's part of the same pattern. How do I instill fear and terror in the population? And how do I make sure people are so busy with their daily lives that they never get around to political thinking? And I say this, I'm not a racist. I have many friends from Turkey and other countries. But for what I experienced here during my visits to Afghanistan, a gunshot would have been justified, and every judge would have sided with the shooter.
Und jeder Richter hätte dem Schützen Recht gegeben.
Of course, I can't really relate to your experiences here, but the feeling of being in a new reality right now, one where we're directly endangered by our own states, where we're exposed to a regime I could never have imagined, one that just descends upon us like that feeling I share. And I just wonder, can we even get out of this as a society? Or are we already so deep in that the hope the EU might say, oops, we went too far, we need to stop using foreign policy tools against domestic dissidents, is actually an illusion? Do you have any hope for that?
Hast du da irgendwelche Hoffnungen drauf?
Zunächst einmal habe ich keine Hoffnung darauf, dass die
First of all, I have no hope that the bureaucrats in Berlin and Brussels can be stopped that easily. They won't show any understanding because their livelihoods and careers depend on not showing any. Anyone who wants to make a name for themselves in such an apparatus has to prove to their superiors that they are truly efficient. It works just like the state security service in the former East Germany. A few more informers or a few more denunciations are simply added to the files. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter at all. It just needs to be somewhat justifiable. And that's how names end up on the list.
Und so kommen dann Namen auf die Liste. Ein Beispiel ist hier ja
One example here is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Weltwoche, Roger Koppel. So the Neue Zürcher Zeitung launches a campaign saying he might be the next one to end up on the sanctions list. Much of the press copies and picks that up. This creates a climate of opinion that reaches into the bureaucracies in Berlin, Brussels, and also Bern. And then they say, that's actually a really good idea. Let's put him on it. In this way, the press itself has become the sharpest censor, the fiercest informer at the moment, and the most aggressive warmonger. Because, of course, the press is also in the hands of large monopolies, and the ruling elite meets in their clubs and coordinates among themselves.
Sich in ihren Clubs trifft und untereinander verständigt. Sie besuchen dieselben Universitäten, sie sind Mitglied.
They attend the same universities, belong to the same golf clubs, are members of the same tennis clubs, drive the same car brands, and there are also those more exclusive clubs like the Rotarians or the Lions Club. At the North German Broadcasting Corporation, where I worked for many years, there used to be a saying, from red radio to Rotarian radio, and that's a sign of where the real decisions in this society are made, namely outside democratic institutions. That's where the elite coordinate against the people for their own benefit. We live in a kind of Neofeudalism. This Neofeudalism is characterized by the ruling circles distancing themselves from the people. They don't even take the subway anymore. They have no idea what life in the city is really like.
Die wissen gar nicht, wie es in der Stadt zugeht. Sie leben in einer eigenen Welt.
They live in their own world, like Marie Antoinette before the revolution. When people have no more bread, they should eat cake instead. That's how out of touch these people are. And they won't stop, because their own hall of mirrors and their own bubble keep reinforcing their attitude. Things will only change if people put up strong resistance. And that means they must, fully in line with the Constitution, make use of their right to gather peacefully in the open air. And on election day, they must learn to make thoughtful decisions, or, to put it differently, the ruling party cartel must be completely voted out. Because these are the self-servers who keep going, who profit from the war in Ukraine, who collect supervisory board seats, and who stuff their pockets full.
Und die sich die Taschen vollstopfen.
Du bist der mir erklärt hat vor einem Jahr oder vor
You're the one who explained to me a year or a year and a half ago how it happens that in a liberal, free society, a media landscape develops that gradually synchronizes itself and falls into step. You explained it to me back then, using the example of the newspaper Die Zeit, journalists who work as freelancers and depend on getting assignments. And you only get those if you strike a certain tone. That's how you gradually learn how you have to write. And that's how a kind of uniform mush emerges, even in supposedly free work, in a free environment. Do you think the same mechanisms have now taken hold in the larger political sphere? That we in Europe, in a free Europe, are running headlong into a one-way street, a totalitarian one-way street, out of bureaucratic civility, because people just have to get by somehow and go along with it. I mean, once again, everyone just went along.
This is an
economic problem that translates into a socio-psychological question. Capitalism is a problem for democracy. Because under capitalism, the economy is nowhere democratized. We have private ownership of the means of production, and we have the constraints that arise from it. When the means of production are in private hands, the sphere that determines all our lives, the economic sphere, is de-democratized and privately controlled. It is not subject to democratic decision-making or authority. Digitalization, too, is a problem for democracy. It begins where, in the digital world, only what someone has implemented based on their own ideas and uploaded according to their own interests becomes visible.
Und nach eigenen Interessen hochgeladen hat. Alles andere ist in dieser digitalen Welt nicht drin. Wir haben also
Nothing else is possible in this digital world. So within digitality, we have a problem of sources that no longer appears as such. The real-world test of reality disappears behind what we can fish out of the internet. In addition, the capitalist market is changing under neoliberalism. Only those with financial means have access to the market. You can imagine the market like a vegetable market. You can go there and buy vegetables. In the digital world, this market changes. Companies no longer operate in the market. The leading corporations of digital capitalism are the market. Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon are digital markets.
Facebook, Amazon sind digitale Märkte. Am leichtesten ist es mit Amazon zu erklären. Amazon.
The easiest way to explain this is with Amazon. Amazon offers goods at its own discretion, sets the prices, and provides the information needed to identify the product. Amazon decides what appears on the website, and Amazon decides who has access to this market. This means that a large part of our social life has shifted into private hands. Now the capitalist drive aims to turn states into mere functions of large corporations, especially financial ones. The debts of the Ukrainian state are managed by a consortium of BlackRock and JP Morgan.
Damit rückt der ukrainische Staat in die Hand von
This means that the Ukrainian state is falling into the hands of financial investors. Gaza is supposed to become a free economic zone under the leadership and coordination of Tony Blair. In essence, this turns an entire region and the fate of the Palestinian people into a plaything for corporations. And the German chancellor, there's a scholar named Werner Rugemer, an economic historian, he called the chancellor a BlackRock lackey. And if you look at his policies, they will end up burdening the middle class, while large international financial investors like BlackRock reap the benefits. And that's the situation we're in.
Das ist die Situation, in der wir uns befinden. Der Kapitalismus hat ein Problem mit der Demokratie.
Capitalism has a problem with democracy, and it is now in crisis. At its core, it is about maintaining private ownership of the means of production. The overarching form of rule above this economic sphere can be a parliamentary democracy, meant to involve the population and create the illusion of comprehensive democracy. But fascism, too, was a bourgeois form of rule. Likewise, a military dictatorship, such as in Chile, was a bourgeois form of rule. What distinguishes fascism is that it relies on a mass movement. And what is emerging now is a new form of authoritarian rule in the guise of democracy, which no longer truly exists.
Demokratie, die längst nicht mehr existiert. Wir sind bei George Orwell angekommen. Und man bedient
We have arrived at George Orwell. And what is being used here to contain democratic awareness are ideological apparatuses. The goal of these ideological apparatuses is to keep the population quiet without having to use weapons, but instead by persuading them. And that is done by changing the structures of thought. The ideological apparatuses are schools, universities, churches, think tanks, state-funded so-called non-governmental organizations, but also the press, because the press is subject to the laws of capitalist exploitation. Now one could say, okay, but you worked for many years, 40 years in public broadcasting.
Okay, du warst doch viele Jahre, 40 Jahre im öffentlich-rechtlichen Rundfunk tätig. Ja, da ist es so,
Yes, in this case, the Broadcasting Council decides on the allocation of leadership positions, especially those outside the collective bargaining agreements, based on proposals from the administrative board. And once again, it's exactly the politicians and their close associates sitting there who are supposed to be under oversight. So this system has a built-in flaw, and that's how we move in times of crisis. When economic growth slows down, when the profit rate declines, and you can see that across all European countries over the past 40 years, the bourgeoisie tends to stabilize profits by turning to authoritarian forms of rule and new wars, because then capital is destroyed and the process of original accumulation can begin again. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine.
I'm
really worried that what you just laid out for us, beautifully laid out, by the way, is exactly what's happening. I mean, I wish it weren't true, but I think your analysis is right. And the question I keep asking myself is, what can we do about it? I mean, we don't want this. There's a huge part of the population that not only thinks critically, but also takes action. and right now there's a lot of unrest. So, what can we do to get out of this social crisis that we've also brought upon ourselves, without ending up in an even bigger war? The war in Ukraine is already bad enough.
Also der Krieg ist ja schon schlimm genug in der Ukraine und es ist ein Stellvertreterkrieg, auch ein Stellvertreterkrieg des Kapitalismus.
This is a proxy war. Also a proxy war of capitalism, of European capitalism. How can we stop it so that it doesn't consume all of Europe? And maybe that's the transition. You've now started your own YouTube channel, where you try to analyze complex topics together with guests. In a beautiful format, by the way. I just want to say that again. Patrik Baab not only does excellent work in terms of content, but also presents it very skillfully, with all your experience from television and radio. Is it a way to create a counterpublic and say, we do not agree? Is that at least one of the approaches we need to take?
Ja, ich stimme hier dem Italiener.
I agree here with the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci. What matters is to regain cultural hegemony. We must reclaim the public sphere from the schemes and propaganda of the warmongers, and that can only be done with good arguments, by advocating for our position. Of course, good arguments also need to be presented in an engaging way. Counterpublic is the key term for me. That's why my YouTube channel is called Against the Current. The Polish poet Stanisław Lech once wrote, "Whoever wants to reach the source must swim against the current." When others are running in one direction, you have to look the other way, toward where they came from, because that's where the cause must lie.
Dann muss man in die andere Richtung gucken, da wo sie herkommen, denn da muss die Ursache liegen. Und das ist das Ziel dieses Kanals.
And that is the goal of this channel. I always begin with the word, I present to you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media conceal. That is precisely the goal, to reopen the space for debate. Over the course of my life, I have traveled around a bit, and from that, many conversation partners have emerged, of course in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, throughout Eastern Europe, in Russia, and also in Scandinavia. These people should have a voice on my channel and explain their ideas. That does not mean that I always agree with them. I want to give them the opportunity to clarify their position.
Ich möchte ihnen die Möglichkeit geben, ihre Position herauszuschälen. Und dann können sich die Menschen selbst ein Urteil.
And then people can form their own judgment, compare it with their experiences and think, they see it that way. Maybe there's something to it. Maybe we can use that for our own reflections. Maybe it's useful here too. Why do we see it differently? What's the situation in other countries? And that comparison must be possible. My friend Michael Andrick, the philosopher, puts it this way. We need to examine our information diet. We need to check where we get our information from, and we need to achieve digital literacy. It's not enough to just sit in front of the TV in the evening with a bottle of beer or a glass of wine and let ourselves be entertained. Nowadays, it's part of life to actively seek out information ourselves.
Informationen selbst aktiv zu suchen. Wir schauen das, was die Propagandamedien sagen.
We look at what the propaganda media are saying. We get our information from the new media and compare it with what the British and Americans know, what the French know. We compare it, as far as language allows, with how things are assessed in Russia, and we benefit from that. And above all, we do one thing. We test reality. We put things to the test. That's why I can say today that the critical audience mainly comes from those people in the middle class who work in a trade themselves. Today you can have a more reasonable conversation with any master butcher than with an academic, because academics live in their own bubble.
Weil die Akademiker in ihrer Blase sitzen. Die anderen müssen einen Betrieb führen. Sie müssen Lehrlinge.
The others have to run a business, they have to train apprentices, they have to do the accounting, they have to make sure the customer is satisfied and the quality is right. And these people have a completely different, direct connection to reality than those who make their money through ideology, propaganda, and conformity. That's one thing. The potential for resistance is growing. When you leave the cities, it develops in rural areas. The potential for resistance is found less and less in the academic world, and more in the middle class, in the trades, and in agriculture. And in Germany, it is found especially in the East rather than in the West. Because people in the East say, these tendencies toward dictatorship, we've seen all that before.
Das haben wir alles schon mal erlebt. Das brauchen wir nicht nochmal. Und daran erinnern die sich genau.
We don't need to go through that again, and they remember it very clearly. Whereas sometimes with those in West Germany, you get the feeling they've got blinders on and don't want to see what's really happening. That's who the YouTube channel is for. It's meant to be interesting, exciting, a wide range of knowledge, from musicians and artists to philosophers, politicians, economists, whatever people want, from all over the world. And they should engage in discussion with the people. Then we can broaden the spectrum, and only in that way can we step out of the bell jar of propaganda that NATO and governments place over us by pouring billions into the machinery of confusion and illusion.
Den Vernebelungs- und Illusionsapparat einspeisen.
Ich finde das sehr gut.
I think that's very good. I think it's very important. That's one of the motivations that drives me to make it visible. Also to show how many voices there are. Because one of the problems we have in mainstream media is that you keep seeing the same faces. By the way, that's also partly a problem we have in online media. Because there are people who are popular, they keep getting invited. But what that actually does is narrow the perception of people who think the same way.
Der Leute, die eigentlich auch so denken. Also je weiter und je mehr Leute wir einladen, umso mehr sie...
So the further we go, and the more people we invite, the more you can actually see how large this group is. Even if the group isn't all in the same geographic area. But we really are, well, a broad field, not just in the West, but also a large part of the global South, which actually shares the analyses that underlie our reporting. Do you feel that you can also be successful on your channel if you popularize those voices that are outside Europe and outside the West? Or do you feel that there's nothing more exciting than the truth, and nothing more fascinating than life itself?
Nichts Erregenderes als die Wahrheit und nichts Spannenderes als das Leben selbst. Ich habe eine Frau interviewt, Olga Petersen.
I interviewed a woman, Olga Peterson, who was an AfD member of the Hamburg parliament and had to flee to Russia because they wanted to take her children away.
Fliehen musste, weil man die Kinder wegnehmen wollte.
I saw the conversation.
Und diese Frau hat auf meinem Kanal...
And this woman got more than 300,000 clicks on my channel in a very short time, more than 300,000 views, and received the most messages. That means a fascinating, unusual life that offers a special perspective on reality, captures, and holds people's attention. I have to say, sometimes people who stand a bit on the periphery are the more interesting ones, because they can combine distance and closeness, and therefore often see more clearly. And Olga Peterson is one of them. It is a journalist's task to find such people and let them speak. Because these people represent a large group of others who are not given the chance to speak. Because no one asks them. Because they have no voice, or because they cannot express themselves well.
Und dabei spielt es auch jetzt gar keine Rolle, dass Olga Petersen...
And it really doesn't matter now that Olga Peterson has fled to Russia. I'm also not spreading Kremlin narratives, as I'm often accused of doing. If the Kremlin picks up and shares my ideas, that's not my problem. I work here completely independently, and of course I also talk with Lord Skidelsky, a member of the British House of Lords. I talk with American journalists and guests, and of course with the French as well, that's obvious. These different perspectives are fascinating. Of course, on my channel, you have to take the time to listen to people. You can't just tune in and out. I want to give people the opportunity to fully express a thought, and that simply means making the effort to listen.
Dazu gehört es einfach auch, sich die Mühe zu machen und zuzuhören. Der Erfolg gibt mir recht, ich habe Tausende von Zuschriften.
Success proves me right. I've received thousands of letters, since I did on-site research in Ukraine, in western Ukraine, but also in the war zone in the Donbass on the side of the Russian troops. And it shows that many people don't dare to speak up, but they're glad when someone does. They give me courage and strength. In recent years, I've needed that support, and I want to sincerely thank everyone who hears this. But I also say, you have to make the effort, and then we can reach many people. If we can reach maybe a fifth, a quarter, or even a third of the people, then there lies the opportunity to understand, to think things through, and to come to new insights.
Aber dies weiterzutreiben in eigenständig.
But taking this further into independent action, participation in protests, writing to one's district representative, attending assemblies, and raising one's voice, that is a completely different step. It is, as Hegel would call it, the transformation from quantity into a new quality, and many have not yet taken this step. But one thing is clear, those who sleep in a democracy will wake up in a dictatorship. Democracy requires the ability to act and the ability to govern oneself. One becomes capable of acting through action, and one gains self-determination through a clear mind, not through passive consumption.
Durch einen klaren Kopf und nicht durch Berieselung.
Und auch wenn man sich gewahr
And also, when you realize that you don't have to be intimidated by the size of the problem. I'm sometimes asked, what can I do? I regularly get emails that say, how could I contribute? And the answer is always, ask yourself, what can you contribute? You don't have to go to Berlin to overthrow the government, but if you can write a letter to the government, then do that. Or organize a group, then do that. Is it just a drop of water on a hot stone? Yes, but enough drops of water will cool even the hottest stone. So, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But this realization that you can do something, that's also something worth sharing, that we are not just passive material to be acted upon.
Ich bin ein alter Mann. Und ich bin ein paar Mal dem Tod von.
I'm an old man, and I've escaped death a few times, so I don't fear it. But I can't expect the same from a 25-year-old single mother with a temporary contract at some company. That's just not possible. Everyone has to act according to their own circumstances. Dead heroes are of no use, so it's up to each person to take their fate into their own hands. But that's exactly what matters, and that's what I'm suggesting. We're all just simple workers in the Lord's vineyard. That's one side of it. But we're also all a bit like the good soldier Schweik, who can throw sand into the gears when what those up there are doing goes too far.
Wenn uns das, was die oben machen, zu weit geht.
Aber das sieht man schon, also sobald wir uns
But you can already see it. As soon as we move within the journalistic sphere and the public sphere, we automatically find ourselves in a political space as well. How does a good journalist deal with the fact that, on one hand, they want to provide information, but on the other hand, they also want to encourage action? At the same time, we have to be careful not to unduly influence others. Because I would say that's exactly what the mainstream media are doing right now. They are engaging in unfair influence by pretending to depict the real world. And in that supposed real world, Russia is the enemy that must be fought. Meanwhile, I'm trying to say, no, we need to talk about how we understand and interpret the world ourselves. How do you try to resolve this paradox that we want to communicate objectively, yet are still caught within our own framings?
Nun, ich habe das versucht zu erklären im Vorwort zu meinem.
I tried to explain that in the foreword to my book, On Both Sides of the Front, which will be published in Swedish this spring, something I'm very happy about. I approach it by preparing thoroughly and orienting myself according to the current state of research. In my field, that usually means the historical state of research, not a physical or scientific one. For more specific military analyses, I have to consult experts myself. So I prepare carefully, and then I have a network of contacts that operates beyond states and authorities. That naturally comes from a long life as a journalist.
Das erwächst aus einem längeren Journalistenleben natürlich. Man muss die Länder ein wenig kennen, dann hat man in diesen Ländern.
You have to know the countries a little, then you have contacts there and get passed from one person to the next. That's why the authorities, who would love to find out what I'm doing on the ground, who I'm talking to, and how I keep slipping away from them, are often puzzled. Of course, I also have to go through official channels. I have to get accredited, report to military authorities, whatever the procedure is. And of course I do that. Yet I still manage, time and again, to evade control. Naturally, a war zone is completely different. Under surveillance, AWACS, satellites, drones, they can read the newspaper you're carrying under your arm from space. And yet they don't know where I'm going or how it happens that I talk to certain people or how I even know them. And of course I don't tell them that. Whenever I'm asked, I just say it was pure coincidence. I go into a cafe and there he is next to me. Of course, that's not really how it is. In most cases, it's well prepared, and I'm also aware, that's what you're hinting at, that a reporter's view doesn't reach very far. Up to the next wall. What's behind it you can't see. So you have to walk around or ask someone who's been there. And I gather all that information, of course, with recording devices, electronic recordings. But I write day and night.
Das ist die alte Methode. Ich mache unglaublich viele Notizen, die ich nachher wieder.
That's the old method. I take an incredible number of notes that I later have to decipher again. And I'm connected worldwide in my areas of focus, with scientists who do good work like you, with people like John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Richard Sakwa, Ian Proud, and many others. And then I ask them, how do they see it? Have they experienced something similar? Or has someone told me a fairy tale? And that's how one tries to get close to the truth. And that's really what I also expect from journalism, to approach things as impartially as possible, but also to clearly define interests.
Aber auch Interessen klar zu definieren. Ich will rausfinden, ob.
I want to find out whether, and here's what I do. I don't follow the authorities' guidelines. Of course, I still have to obey curfews or lockdowns. And of course, I get interrogated there as well. On the Russian side, I've been interrogated several times for hours. But I'm not telling you everything. I always try to get close to people, the farmers, the soldiers, the merchants, the drivers, the wounded, to talk with them and listen to where the real problems lie, how they manage their daily lives, how they manage in a crisis situation to get by and support their families. And that explains a lot.
Und das erklärt viel. Und da erkenne ich, weil nun.
And that's when I realize I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. In the past 4 years, not one of my dear colleagues has ever asked me, so how are the people there? What are they doing? That means they weren't interested at all. They follow the propaganda narratives because it benefits them professionally. If they don't follow those narratives, they end up in endless debates with their superiors. And a freelancer can't handle that. They just won't get another assignment the next day. That's where the difficulties lie. I try to counteract that. And by the way, I do it at my own expense because journalism, to me, isn't a profession, but a way of life.
Sondern eine Lebensform.
Let's not get into how the other side frames all of this and so on. I think I'd rather know from you. How do you see the idea that reality exists out there and that we have to uncover it? I'm one of those people who say, no, reality is as relative as the thinking of the people who perceive it. What's your ontological approach? Do you think reality exists and journalists uncover it? Or do you think journalists should give people the tools to find reality for themselves?
Ausfindig machen zu können.
Das ist ja kein Widerspruch.
That's not a contradiction. I'm guided here by the dialectical ideas of Hegel and Marx. There is a reality outside human consciousness, but we also influence and change it. Through active work, the reality around us changes, and that in turn shapes us. But even without humans, there would still be a universe and a reality. So in that sense, these are two poles that interact with each other, and through a dialectical process, something new emerges. Of course, it depends on both sides, what we find, how we can change it, and in which direction we want to change it. And we let ourselves be carried along by that.
Und wie können wir es verändern? Und in welche Richtung wollen wir es verändern? Oder lassen wir uns treiben?
Vielleicht noch zum Schluss, was
Maybe to wrap
deine
up,
Pläne jetzt bis
what are your
2026
plans for your
deinem
channel up to
Kanal?
2026?
Die
The interviews you'll be
Interviews,
doing,
die
the
Formate,
formats you're
die
creating,
du jetzt erstellst,
and do you actually present that in written form as well?
führst du das
Or is it
eigentlich dann
mainly
auch
a
in
format
schriftlicher
that's
Form
focused
aus?
on
Oder ist
audio
das
and
jetzt ein
visuals for
Format,
you?
das sich auditiv und visuell vor allem orientiert?
Ich komme eigentlich von der schriftlichen Form, nicht nur vom Fernsehen.
I actually come from the written form, not just from television. I've always written a lot, including books, and then discovered that the reach, and therefore the opportunities to engage with people, is greater when I also explore the audiovisual side. But I don't want to give up writing. The immediate task now is to stabilize the channel so that it becomes easier to bring in specialists, experts in their own lives, for conversations, while also inspiring people. At the same time, new books and articles are to be created. That's the task at the moment.
Das ist im Moment die Aufgabe. Der Schwerpunkt liegt nun darauf, die eigene Publikation.
The focus now is on linking my own publications in publishing houses, but also on Substack, meaning on a Substack channel, with Against the Current on YouTube, so that in a kind of ping-pong effect, I can play with the stylistic devices and different forms of presentation back and forth, thereby increasing the reach. I've noticed that Substack is widely read in the American sphere, while my channel is more visible to the German public, and I'd like to connect the two. Those are the next steps for now, and of course, more trips are planned. This year, I've again received many invitations to panel discussions and lectures, some of which I unfortunately have to decline, otherwise it would become too much. After all, Patrik Baab is Patrik Baab, not a machine.
Denn Patrik Baab ist Patrik Baab und kein Apparat. Ich bin keine Firma.
I'm not a company. We're all just people trying to do what we can and open ourselves up to others. And I think your channel is beautiful. So again, the quality of your work, I can only congratulate you on that. For those looking for the channel, it's called Gegen den Strom, right? Search for it on YouTube, type it in, it should be linked in the description of this video. If it's not linked, then please Google it. I forget things sometimes too. Is there anywhere else people should look to find you?
Gibt es sonst noch einen Ort, an dem dich die Leute finden sollen?
Na, die Menschen finden mich auf Facebook.
Nadine, people find me on Facebook. They find me on my Telegram channel. There, I do something that the YouTube channel can't provide. I also announce events. And sometimes I include information, articles, posts, or videos from acquaintances and friends, like from former CIA analyst Larry Johnson, that are hard to access, so people can see them on my channel as well. All of this doesn't mean that I always share these positions 100%. The point is simply, take a look, engage with it, it's interesting, and come to your own conclusions. I learned a lot from a professor of German studies, Horst Meichner, who said in a lecture, "I expect you, ladies and gentlemen, to think for yourselves about literature." And that's how we should keep it.
Und so wollen wir es doch halten.
That's how we want to keep it, because we are responsible citizens, surrounded by other responsible citizens. That's the kind of society we want to live in. Dear Patrik Baab, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak here.